morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Performance Assurance webinar. My name is Jenny, and I'll be facilitating today's event. And today I'm joined by Anton, Andrew, and Jade from the Performance Assurance team. And just before we get started, I just want to go through some housekeeping with you. So, as always, we ask that you keep your cameras and your microphones off. As always, the event will be recorded, and there'll be an opportunity to refer back to slides and the recording. We'll also be using Slido quite a bit throughout this event. The QR code is on the screen now, and I'll also pop a link in the chat. And I think there's a tab at the top of your team screen as well. And as mentioned, we will be using Slido. So if you have any questions, there is an opportunity to refer to, there's an opportunity for a Q&A at the end. So if there are any questions, just pop them into Slido. So just as people are scanning and popping their names into Slido, I will share the agenda with you. And we have a lot to get through today, so I will hand it over to Anton.
Well, thanks for taking the time to join the meeting. We've put together an agenda based on the one we shared in September at the start of our kind of annual cycle, with some things that are particularly relevant at this time, as well as some standing items. You know, what's the value that we've achieved this quarter, and you know what are we doing next? Before we get in, to make sure we tailor our conversations, we wanted to ask you some very simple questions, and maybe to check the slide is working. Would you mind flicking on to the next, please? So the first question is, what type of party are you? We did signal in our agenda who we thought these things were most relevant for, but it just helps us pick out the right bits. A lot of suppliers. Oh, as well as some other rec users and some MEMS. Okay, that's really helpful. So I just let it tick on a little bit just to make sure that it's not that suppliers have the fastest fingers. But this is helpful. We'll obviously make sure we pick out the key things for suppliers, MEMS, and other users. Okay, without further ado, let's get into it. If we move on to the next slide. So we're showing a few different things today. What are you most interested in? We'll try and adjust our time based on that. I think that's interesting. Small sample size so far. So a lot of interest in theft, which I think we'll all agree is countering theft's a really, really important thing. Also data cleanse. So thankfully we've got Andrew there to cover those two, but we are interested in the performance of parties, performance rec service. My slot, the annual rating, is the least interesting. So there we go. Let's get into my one, and I'll try and be quick. So we tend to try and structure it around broad kind of things you might be interested in. We're interested in making sure we show you the stuff that we're doing, what we've achieved this quarter. A lot of it is for the benefits of the engaged parties, and if we don't tell you, you don't know. We're also thinking about how we're improving the rec, what we're planning on doing next quarter, as well as it's really important for us to say if there's any particular deadlines, which in this kind of work there are kind of cyclic deadlines, and how we're improving performance of the rec services. So if we flick on to the next one, keep going. I think the first thing I need to talk about is the annual rating. So given the feedback, I'll try and go quick. So party ratings are really useful to the code manager. They're established in many places. I won't read the list because I think you've seen these slides in advance. And we can use the ratings to reduce the direct demands on parties, which kind of reduces the cost of parties responding to assurance, but also reduces the cost of assurance, and that's kind of directly in contrast to some of the other codes who do things like market audits, which are quite expensive in the round. Could well be the perfectly right thing for them though. It also provides incentives to work in all areas, and it allows us to communicate to you about what we're doing to tackle outliers as well. There are a performance assurance technique called a peer comparison. It's just an instance of that in the code. Because they're so important, they're governed by the PAB, who are there to check and challenge us and make sure we're making sensible decisions. If we flick on to the next thing, we should talk about the past. So we've been kind of gradually building the annual rating process to make sure people find it predictable and know what bits they have control over. So this started by initially sharing risk driver scores, the information we use to assess risk, over time sharing ratings, but only to a single organisation, and sharing ratings with peers. I noticed most people were suppliers. MEMS don't have this. This has been a DNO and supplier activity. This has focused on like a range of things. It's included qualification, it's including performance assurance techniques, and it's included tackling energy theft for suppliers. There does need to be some kind of common sense applied. So if you're a really, really small supplier with a target of 1, there's a lot of variability between 0, 1, and 2, the kind of likely scores you might get. So very small people might have one element of this like excluded, a de minimis type approach. If we flick on, we understand this is important, although perhaps less important given the slider that we did. So we're working to a timetable which involves lots of opportunities for people to get involved. In the February PAB, which is only a few days ago really, we started talking to the PAB about the criteria and the approach and the considerations. Whilst there's still time, it's not just straight to a decision. We'll be consulting on the annual rating, and the PAB will then review to make sure that we've taken the right responses to those consultations, taken seriously, and made appropriate adjustments where that's appropriate. Last year we had a query window, which we think is really, really, really important. So you can see your rating before it goes anywhere and check that it is as you expected it. And if not, have a chat and unpick it and make sure that data is right. In September, that's the kind of time we would be looking for providing market-wide scores. That's the kind of timeline. We've discussed this with the PAB already, and we've formulated a change. We think it's important to use some of those change processes to get the best quality consultation that we can. So that will mean that there's rigorous consultation coming through the summer. We will make sure we meet the code requirements for publication. There are rules that kind of bind us. We've always met those in the past and will continue to do so. We'll consult on our approach. That query window, I think, is an incredibly important point, and we'll publish our methods, including timelines and criteria. If we flick on, so this is an area where we have received a lot of feedback in the past, and some of that feedback is kind of straightforward, but much of it is about trade-offs. So one feature a party might want, maybe in contrast to one feature that conflicts with that another party is saying is good. So we do need to work out our way through some of those trade-offs, and make sure that we get to sensible positions. Some of the feedback would require substantial changes to switching processes, and that doesn't feel right. That feels like perhaps the analogy is the tail wagging the dog. We shouldn't be trying to re-engineer the processes to make a kind of an easier annual rating or a more powerful annual rating of some description. That felt disproportionate to us. But we do take this feedback very, very seriously. We've worked with the PAB to understand some of the various options and start to kind of prune the wide array of possibilities that are out there. Our expectation for 2024-25 is that the ratings will apply to DNOs and suppliers. I think that's the key message here, that we don't expect other organisations to have a rating of this this sort. We are thinking about how that could happen for MEMS in future years, but that kind of gradual process is just as important to them as it is to suppliers and DNOs if that happens. There are quite a few other elements of the design that we're looking at. I believe there's a white pad paper if anyone really loves being geeky and getting into the details. I do think we're looking at a periodic rating, but actually we're considering and working on those, and they'll be part of the change. They're kind of more design factors to make sure that you can see them and have an opportunity. So other than that big ticket, we do expect it will be DNOs and suppliers. The other bits we will work up, we will kind of refine, and we will consult on. I think that's the end of what I wanted to say. If anybody had a question, I'd be more than happy to take questions either now or I think there's a Q&A at the end.
Yeah, so far there aren't any questions in the Slido just yet, so I think we can move on, Anton.
Good morning, everybody. Obviously, based on the feedback, we'll spend a little bit of time on theft. If we can go to the next slide, please. There we go. Thank you. So again, slides have gone out, so I won't sort of read all the bullets out, and hopefully, kind of people are generally aware of the importance of theft detection, both in terms of some of the license and schedule obligations, but obviously also the underlying safety considerations that are also part of theft detection and avoidance. We really going to talk about, or I'm going to talk about a few things today. So just give a bit of an update on kind of where we currently see the data, some upcoming activities that you should be aware of, hopefully already, but just as perhaps a reminder. And then also, I was going to talk a bit more about our 173, but as I'll mention in a second, we had been hoping that was going to be approved by Ofgem this week. Ofgem have decided to send that back and not approve that change at this time. So that literally happened yesterday. So that obviously needs to be worked through. So I probably won't go through quite as much detail on that, given that that's obviously a little bit more up in the air at the moment. Although I would be keen when we get to that section to hear from any parties' views around that sort of decision and whether people are continue to be supportive of the change, which I think based on TIG interactions, did have a bit of support really. So that will help us influence and decide how we go forward with that. So if we go to the next slide. So just some kind of macro numbers. You can see most of this stuff actually in the dashboards, but obviously you may or may not have looked at those, but currently, we've got reporting through to December 24 available, so that's sort of 9 months of the scheme year. Data for January was due for its first submission window earlier this week, in fact yesterday, because it is only Tuesday. And obviously, we're sort of working through and processing that data at the moment. So we do continue to see an upward trend in activity year on year. Over the last sort of 2-3 years of the scheme, which ultimately is down to all of those who are involved in theft detection, putting their shoulder to the wheel. So, thank you to all of those that are making that effort. If we look at year-on-year data, we've got about a 9 percentage point increase in reported investigations. That's not necessarily confirmed thefts, but investigation activity. It's worth noting over the last couple of years, we have been encouraging the reporting of all investigations, not just confirmed investigations, which was perhaps the previous trend. So, we need to be a little bit careful with that statistic. But broadly speaking, sort of good to see that activity. Also, really interestingly, about a 13 percentage point increase in confirmed thefts, and that's increasing across all of the segments. And if we go to the next slide, we'll just pop that on a graph. So domestic, for those who aren't in the domestic sector, was split this year between smart and non-smart. So we've got the kind of orangey yellow coloured stat chart compared to the kind of total domestic pot from previously. And we can see across all of those, as I say, both, you know, an increase year on year across all 4 of those pots in terms of confirmed thefts reported to date. That's a year to date comparison. Obviously, otherwise, you know, we'd have an extra 3 months in the prior year numbers. But also important to, or I guess interesting to sort of, you know, look at the relative size of the 4 pots. So, you know, we see obviously considerably more theft in domestic electricity reported than any of the other areas. So, the other thing I draw out, I guess, is that when we did the split between smart and non-smart, that was sort of on the basis that there was a hypothesis that there probably was less theft from smart meters, not no, and obviously there are different theft modes, but for a variety of reasons, there was a hypothesis that suggested that there would probably be, on average, more theft within non-smart meters than smart, and that does seem to be borne out in the results so far. And actually, we've made a couple of adjustments to parameters in this year's theft target setting, as again we'll talk about in a second, to reflect particularly the split in gas that we're seeing there. If we go on to the next slide, so just breaking that down a little bit more for domestic on the left, so keeping that kind of yellow browny color scheme, just having a look at sort of almost conversion rate, so to speak, so investigations versus confirmed thefts. We see a bit of a greater conversion on electricity than we do on gas, but you know, kind of the proportions broadly remain kind of consistent across the investigations and the confirmed theft. So, but you know, interesting to see that. And then finally on the pie chart on the right, looking more at what we sort of term engagement. So effectively working down the legend from kind of I guess ideally what we'd see down to kind of less ideal scenario. So parties with confirmed theft submitted is about half of the parties with a target. We've got a number with investigations submitted, but no confirmed thefts yet. So, you know, obviously still taking action, but you know, not always necessarily saying that those investigations are identifying confirmed and reportable theft. We've then got about whatever that is, about 20% of the a bit under 20% actually of the population where we've got ongoing data queries being worked through. So obviously there's data being submitted, but there's some challenges with processing that, and we continue to engage with those parties to resolve that and get that data through. And then we've got the kind of remainder, which is where we've had no theft data reported, and we've split that between those who've just got a target of 1. So obviously, you know, generally quite small market shares, and you know, perhaps would expect a lower level of activity, although not nil. You are still part of the scheme. And then that small wedge with no theft data reported at all. I would highlight, linking back to Anton's presentation, one of the criteria that has been looked at as part of annual rating in previous years has been engagement with the theft scheme. So if you are a party that isn't currently submitting any investigations at all, you might want to look at that over the next couple of months before the kind of closure of the data. So again, we can get odd little differences here where we've got kind of grouped parties. You've got a kind of residual old party knocking around from pre-merger, so there might be, you know, the odd anomaly within that, but just to kind of give a bit of a flavour for that level of engagement. So hopefully that was kind of useful just to get a bit of a sense as to, you know, where the scheme is year to date. As I say, running slightly ahead of prior year. So you know, we'll obviously expect to see hopefully that continue through the next couple of months, and that will then obviously impact in the overall results and the debit and credit calculations. I'll just pause for a second in case there was any questions. Obviously, if not, we can pick up at the end. So if we then move forward a slide, I'm going to just update on a couple of activities that are happening kind of now or starting to happen now. That again, if you're an energy supplier, you should be aware of. So the first is the 25-26 target. So 25-26 theft year starts in April. The target methodology has gone through a review and consultation process starting last autumn, and we've talked about that at previous webinars and other engagement sessions. The final consultation on that concluded at early February, and there's an updated TTM. You can see that on the portal. There's a link in the slides if you have those. Relatively limited change to the prior year, but a couple of adjustments. So in particular, I mentioned on the smart non-smart split on gas, we've slightly changed the weighting there to reflect what we've been seeing in the outcome, and we've also looked at the relative scale of the gas domestic and non-domestic pots and moved some of the target from non-domestic to domestic to reflect ongoing changes in kind of the overall market picture. And then some changes of weighting and numbers based on kind of greater penetration of smart meters. So although lower probability, there are just more smart meters than previously. Those targets were calculated and were published last week. So they are available to parties on your theft dashboard, which is available in the portal. All contract managers and alternates were notified of that last, I think Friday was the email. We would ask that you do go in and just review, check you can see those targets and provide a positive confirmation back as per that email. Just helps us track to make sure that everybody has seen their targets, has had the opportunity to confirm those. If you are a party with a very small market share or a small market share in certain of the segments, so for example, you might have a non-domestic target but not a domestic target, and you will see entries for the pots with 0 target where that applies. So you can see that as well. So if you could reply back to the inquiries mailbox by the 1st of April. They're just tracking to make sure that people have seen those targets and are aware of them. Hopefully, for most parties, that should be a process you're familiar with, and really those who had targets last year broadly have got targets this year, with the majority of change really occurring off the back of organic and inorganic portfolio change, and with some impact in gas in particular because of the TTM changes. So call for action there. Please go check, have a look at targets, come back, confirm you've done that. Next slide, please. Second thing that's just starting to ramp up now, even though we're not out of this theft year yet, is this theft year will, as I say, conclude at the end of March. So we're starting to ramp up and get ready for the closure of that scheme year and the associated debit credit calculations. And there are some actions that parties will need to take over the next few months in association with that. So currently we are doing some kind of preliminary data checking. We've identified a relatively small number of anomalies in data submitted by parties, in particular, where there seems to be some doubling up across incentive pots, particularly between smart and non-smart. Obviously, we need to make sure there's not double counting in the calculations. So we will be contacting individual parties directly in respect of that to just query some of that data. And if you do get one of those queries, please do obviously have a look at that and come back and engage with us around that, which may require submission of some small corrections to that. It's not a large, kind of number relative to the overall thefts, but we just want to make sure that data is robust, and we think starting to do that work now just sort of gets us a little bit ahead of the game before the scheme year fully closes out, bearing in mind the reporting timelines that exist. You should already be looking at your theft dashboard monthly, checking that the confirmed theft numbers match what you were expecting to see, and if it doesn't, first of all checking the tab that shows you rejected submission lines. So not a file that's been rejected, but the files come through from a format point of view, but the actual theft itself has been rejected, and there'll be a reason as to why that is. If there isn't something on there, or that still doesn't stack up with what you're expecting, then the right thing to do is to raise a query to us, and we will then obviously work with parties to help understand why some things have been rejected, or if there's some data that's got missing at some point in the process. Obviously, the earlier we're doing that, the better, and you should be doing that over the course of the year. And obviously, I know a number of parties do, because we get tickets every month about that sort of stuff. 1st of May then is the point at which you should be submitting your final set of theft data for the reporting year in terms of its sort of primary submission. So that's the March data submission window, which is obviously the last month of the year. So please make sure you do that. We will send out reminders, just given it's the end of year. And then if we move on to the next slide, there is then a final submission window the following month. So as you hopefully be aware, there is a sort of almost do submit after 1 month, but there's a kind of an opportunity to make sort of corrections, etc. in early June. So 2nd of June is the first working day, so that's the cutoff. That then should be it for submitting data. You'll be able to then review your final numbers from the 17th of June, which is when the dashboards get published. Have a look at those, raise any final queries, although as I say, the earlier you raise queries, the more helpful for everybody. Also at that point, we need to know if there's been any portfolio acquisitions or disposals that you haven't already communicated to us. So there is a particular rule in the scheme where you effectively buy the entire portfolio of another supplier. So if you have done that, you do need to notify us of that. Again, there'll be prompts that come out to contract managers for these actions. Any final queries on those numbers need to come to us by the 15th of July. We obviously then need to work through those as quickly as possible, which is why I'm trying to encourage people to submit queries earlier than that if we can do. And then by the 22nd of August, although again we'll do it earlier if we can, we will have then taken those final numbers, done the maths, applied the various rules that are in the code, and we will have calculated the debits and credits, and they will go up on the dashboards as usual. And those will then subsequently go through the invoicing processes with Reco. So really, as I say, some key dates coming up to be aware of. Please make sure that you're kind of aware of those, and obviously some of those are starting to get towards the summer. So if you've got people in the team or you yourself are on a holiday over any of those periods, make sure you've kind of planned for that in advance. You've thought about cover or early engagement. And as I say, really key for all of that is please do engage early. The earlier we engage, the better, really. I think there's a question. Is there on the slide? Oh, sorry. Let's have a look.
Yes, Andrew. The question is there a reason?
Oh, yeah, I've got it here. Yeah. So reason being asked to email confirming they've reviewed the targets. June, really, it's just to make sure that people have gone in and checked them. We've had stuff in the past where people said, "Oh, I didn't know there was a target," etc. So we're just trying to be really diligent in terms of making sure people have gone, they understand they're looking in the right place. Nothing.
Sorry, Andrew. I was just querying why both the contract manager and the alternate are being asked. I mean, it caused a little bit of confusion within our business. I would have thought that one confirmation would have sufficed.
One confirmation is fine. Apologies. Yeah, sorry, hadn't quite got the subtlety of your question there, June. So yeah, we just need a confirmation back from your organisation. The reason the messages have gone to contract managers and alternates is just to make sure that the message gets across. Occasionally contract managers will be, out for an extended period or whatever it might be. So we just want to make sure that somebody's got that message. So yeah, sorry, to be clear, we don't need two confirmations. One is absolutely fine. But thanks for asking the question, Jim.
I think that's all the questions for now, Andrew. So
Sure.
if you'd like
All right, we shall keep going then. So final slides on theft. I was going to talk a bit more in detail about some changes we were expecting to need to make because of R173 being implemented. So as a reminder, R173 was the change that was being progressed whereby payments would be made for certain desktop investigations and site visits, as well as confirmed thefts under the scheme. And the intention was that would be kicking in from 25-26. So that was going to need to have various changes. Some of those changes would be made in part for 173, but were also supportive of other activity. So we do now need to sort of unpick that a little bit and work out what happens next. And as I say, literally, we got that notification yesterday afternoon. So we haven't kind of worked through all of that yet as a co-manager team. So I can't tell you what's going to happen. Unfortunately, I'm not proposing, therefore, I'll go through the detail of the next couple of slides because some of that may not be applicable anymore. And so I don't want to take up people's time with something we're not sure about yet. But I did just want to flag, because again, you may not have seen yet that decision was made, that the change has not currently been approved. And it's, as I say, as yet unclear as to what will happen next, but obviously more communication will be issued once that's been worked through. As I alluded to earlier, however, it would just be interesting if there are any views around that decision to sort of capture those. Obviously, that change had been worked through a number of TIG meetings, and I think, whilst certainly not being viewed as a panacea for all ills within theft or TDIS design, I think had been viewed broadly positively and was broadly supported by those who'd responded to impact assessment and consultation. So if there are any thoughts around that decision, or if people are still thinking no, we were supportive of that change, I'd be interested just to hear if there are any thoughts on that before we move on. Claire?
Hiya. Just reading the decision letter yesterday, it felt like Ofgem were not supportive of there being an incentive scheme in its entirety. I don't know what you thought, but I mean, to your point about the change, we supported it. It gives suppliers credit for the work that they're doing. I mean, some of the charts that you showed earlier in the presentation shows absolutely how many investigations are done. And how many actually result in a confirmed theft. So there's lots of work happening that, currently that we're not getting credit for, if you like. But yeah, reading the decision notice, it talked about not being the right behaviour, not necessarily being the right behaviours, encouraging the wrong behaviours from suppliers, and it just seemed that they were perhaps saying the whole thing was that they weren't supportive of it. So I don't know whether anybody else read it the same way, but I did think, oh God, is this going to then therefore lead to us looking at it again in the round, like, is an incentive scheme the right thing to be having? That's what I took from the letter. I don't know whether anyone else got a similar opinion or different.
That's fair. I'll kind of pause, see if anybody else wants to chip in.
Maybe it's too early days.
Maybe, yeah. As I say, some people may not even have seen necessarily, because it did come out yesterday afternoon. So, yeah. So I would encourage people to go have a look at that. As I say, we will be, initially as a code management team, obviously looking at that and working out what the next steps are. I suspect it may then go to the next sort of TIG meeting, although I don't think the timing of that is very helpful, unfortunately. And clearly, the timing not brilliant from the perspective of I think it'll be difficult for something to happen in the next 28 days, if you see what I mean. And I completely appreciate that we ideally don't want to be changing the scheme mid-year type thing. So that creates some challenges, I think. So yeah. Okay, well, any other thoughts as people do see that? We would be interested to hear them. And it just may, as I say, input into some of the further engagement that's needed around this. So do let us know.
I've popped the Ofgem's letter in the chat if people want to have a look at it.
Thanks, man. Great. So I'm not sure if Jenny or somebody else is driving the slides, but you can effectively skip forward a couple of slides because the next couple were 173 related. Those who have read those slides, some of those things may still happen. We may still look at whether some of those are the right things to be doing anyway. So we may come back to that, but I just don't want to spend time on it now in case some of that goes. So we'll update on that as soon as we can do. So the other topic that I was also due to cover, so sorry, I have to put it with me for a few more minutes, is data cleanse. So again, if we move forward a slide. So a bit of scene setting. Again, hopefully most people are aware of why we do the data cleanse sprints and some of the context. But data is clearly super important to how the industry works. I was also feeling very poetic when I wrote the slides and called it the lifeblood of processes. And clearly there's a number of impacts that bad or kind of poor quality and incomplete data can have on processes that occur and impacts on both parties and consumers. And it's also important to remember that the bar is continually being raised in terms of what actually should we have in terms of data, whether that's through industry programs, whether that's through just in general as society continues to become increasingly digital and data driven. As you hopefully know, we use the data cleanse sprints to try and focus work on a small number of items at a time, trying to have a consistent approach for everybody and avoid what I think had been something parties had raised previously, which was, I'm focusing on issue A, you're focusing on issue B. As switches happen, kind of my pot never goes down, your pot never goes down, because we're sort of switching issues between us. So I think broadly speaking, those cleanse sprints have been have kind of worked okay. And we've seen some good results from those, and where we haven't perhaps seen as much progress as we would have liked, it's nonetheless perhaps open the lid on what's sort of driving that. As a reminder, we're in the tail end of sprint 3 at the moment, so the measurement point for that will be the data that we get at the end of March, and that will then be used to sort of see how everybody's got on and sort of take the necessary actions. If we just go on to the next slide, what I thought it might be worth doing is just giving a bit of a kind of perspective and a status update on kind of where things stand at the moment. So there's kind of 4 groups, I guess, within the current sprint. So the first item was actually some items that didn't get fully cleansed in sprint 2, so energized no meter and invalid electricity map reports. So there was some good progress on those in sprint 2, but it didn't quite get over the line for everybody. So we put a 3-month extension in, so till halfway through the sprint, with Christmas as it fell. That then meant we were following up on that in January. That extension period is now finished. Good progress made by most parties in that, with most people either hitting the target or getting very close. For those who haven't met the target, we have then applied performance assurance techniques now, given that there's been kind of two targets, if you like. For most of those, it's really been just sort of getting that final confirmation that last little bit will get closed out before the end of March. I'd say a lot of good progress had been made. For a couple of parties though, where there had been much less progress, then we've applied more stringent pacts in the form of action plans. Again, we've seen good engagement on those from those parties, so do appreciate that people have recognised the importance of that. But I think also just so you are aware, that where we continually don't see the activity we need to, then we will use some of those more, I guess, directive pacts to push that along. So that was on sprint 2 extension. Although I will come back to energized no meter in a second, because unfortunately, having got that number down, it is ramping back up again. So we are going to need to look at that again. Invalid top line then was the second group of reports that we were looking at, linked to some of the MHHS changes and focusing on those top line elements that will continue post MHHS. There were 2 sets of reports here: supplier, which was at a relatively low value, and we've seen some progress on this within the supplier reports, although there's a little bit of a way still to go. And then on the D&O side, there was more volume. We've definitely seen more activity there. At the same time, although parties are clearing, we're seeing more items getting added to that each month as well. So the kind of net numbers not really moving as much as we perhaps would have liked. That may be a consequence of other cleanse activity then kind of pushing stuff over. There is a little bit of a piece there. We've also had some discussions with a few DNOs through the last couple of months, as they've needed to engage with us on this. And I think there's been obviously a ramping up of activity. So I'm still kind of hoping that we're going to see a bit of a surge of things over the next month of items being cleansed or exemptions submitted. But we will need to obviously see where we end up on the sprint. CDSP reconciliations. So this we are seeing more limited progress in. So as a reminder, this is the first time we've had gas data being cleansed through this process. And it is reliant on the annual CDSP rec, so that data is becoming increasingly stale now. Because we only get that data annually, we do rely on parties self-reporting their cleanse. And again, I appreciate that's probably been a slight change for some people in terms of a process. So we are sort of expecting that we may see a little bit of an uptick. And again, I know from conversations with a couple of parties, they have been doing quite a bit of work and kind of bundling all of that together, and we're going to see a bit of a surge of those exemptions coming through. We have also had a couple of parties try to submit those exemptions but not quite get the data right, so they haven't quite reflected in the results yet, but obviously we can see that there's activity there, so it's just working through that. A rec issue is either has been or is being raised regarding the key barrier here, I think, which is the fact that CDSP rec is annual. To raise the prospect, it is defined in code that happens, and it happens annually. But I think there would be a general consensus that moving up the frequency of that, whether that's done by CDSP, whether it moves over to Code Manager, is kind of I guess a second layer of the onion. But I think getting more frequent data would be super helpful in terms of both helping people be looking at more timely issues and also helping us track the resolution of those issues. So that is happening in parallel. And then we'd added, and we had to edit mid-sprint in the end because of some delays with the data, what we collectively call the new MTD items. So that's the ESME ID, the meter location, and the number of registered digits. And we've been focusing on that only for installations that happened after the data cutoff for data cleanse in the MHHS program, who did the bulk load and population of that. MHHS program has obviously got a separate data working group running and has some significant cleanse targets set around that historic data as well, which I'm sure parties will be aware of if you're kind of caught up in that. So we've seen a little bit of reduction in volume here. We did actually have to change the cutoff date because the program updated the information that they shared with us around the cutoff date. So actually it came a little bit later. So obviously took a few things off the list as well, although not loads to be fair. We are aware that parties have been perhaps more focused on that historic program-driven data cleanse first, given relative timelines and deadlines. So that more limited progress is perhaps expected. What I would say on that is, even if you are focusing most of your remediation effort on that historic cleanse, do just take a look at the reports that you're getting, because if you are seeing that, you know, a certain portion of your new installations each month are going on this report, i.e. where that data has not been correctly populated as it should be now, you may want to, you know, just have a look and see, is there any pattern in that, you know, in terms of a particular, you know, region of the country, for example, where that's happening, where you may want to engage with you know, the meter installation teams around that to, you know, kind of try and almost like nip that in the bud, rather than, you know, continue to have to fix on the issue. I was going to flick up the latest dashboards, but actually I think, to be honest, I've probably kind of verbally talked through most of that, and the key thing I would have shown in the dashboards, to be honest, was that the Energize No Meter report, having come down heavily in the last sprint, has unfortunately started to come back quite a bit. Targets on data cleanse sprints, so you can see them on the portal in the wiki. There is a page on data cleanse and it has the targets, and we also do message them out at the start of the sprint to contract managers, and we also generally do that at the rig meeting as well. So if you need to know what they are, then that is the place to look. And if you give me a second, I will I can quickly run through what they are for the current sprint, although I will actually go on the wiki just to make sure I don't misquote myself. So the Sprint 2 extensions were effectively to get those populations down to nil. Energize no meter was anything installed after a month. So we kind of accept that there may be some small timing discrepancies. I'm now being let down by the my web browser in terms of getting into the wiki. So give me one second. The top line for suppliers, then the target was to get that down to nil. There was a fairly small volume in that, and for DNOs was to get that down by 80%. On kind of rationale there being that there was probably some quick wins, and then there's obviously a bit of a tail, 80-20 rule. For CDSP, we'd asked parties specifically to focus on those differences where all 3 data items that are matched are different. So that is the meter serial number, the meter manufacturer, and the meter model. The CDSP reports do include all items, but it does tell you in a column, which items don't match. So focus should be on those where all 3 don't match. And we were hoping for a 60% reduction in that volume. Obviously, the measurement of that, as I say, is reliant on the self-reporting. And then finally, the new MTD items, which appears to have dropped out of the wiki, is slightly more complicated, but we were looking for no more. Let me just get the exact language here because this was slightly complicated, I'm afraid. So we differentiated between meters installed within the last month, excuse me, and those installed more than a month ago. So for meters installed within the last month, obviously that's a rolling measurement, then no more than 10% of all installations, as measured based on having a meter installation date in the last month within EES, would appear on the report. So i.e. 90% of your installations have the data populated, 10% or less don't. And for meter installations that are over a month old, that number is 5% instead of 10%. So what we're essentially sort of trying to allow for is there might be a bit of kind of exception resolution that needs to go on, or a bit of lagginess in the reporting, but then that should come down. So hopefully that provides lots of answers to that question. So the final thing I wanted just to talk about in Data Cleanse is what's next. So as I say, Sprint 3 is coming to an end in March. So we obviously need to start thinking about Sprint 4. Now, given what I've said about the status of some of those reports in Sprint 3, I think Sprint 4 will probably largely carry over some of the items from Sprint 3. But we've put some thoughts on the slide. I'll just chat through briefly here. So Energize No Meter, as I say, that was prioritized in Sprint 2. We saw good improvement in that. We carried over the remainder into Sprint 3, but it was just focused on that original target from Sprint 2. We have now unfortunately seen a bit of an uptick in that reporting. It's back to about 40% of the Sprint 2 start position. So we've come down net 60%, but we were down, kind of 90%, and it's coming back. That is important, and it was something that the MHHS program had originally asked us to include in Sprint 2. So we think probably we will need to put it back into Sprint 4 and do a further drive on that. And obviously we probably need to also understand in a bit more detail why that's coming back, because kind of having got that number down, what's causing it to lift back up again. We think the DNO invalid top line probably isn't going to hit that target from Sprint 3, so we think we need to carry that over to Sprint 4. And those top line changes, as I say, again, are linked to MHHS program. So do you want to try and get that resolved over the next sprint, because that really will then start to hit the hit the targets. Sorry, hit the sort of deadline for M10. We've got a new item that we're proposing to bring based on some new data available to us. So we've got access to some new gas related data, and we've been looking at some of the data, and that one of the issues that was raised to us was around population of the map ID. There's over 6 million meters that don't have a valid map ID within the data. We are just doing some further diligence checking on that, but that's what the data shows at the moment. We're proposing to prioritise roughly 750,000 smart meters within that population where the map ID is but mostly missing. There's a few invalid, but it's mostly missing. We are engaging in parallel with maps so that we are hoping to be in a position to provide, as part of the reporting, them, if you like, we're going to get the maps to tell us what meters they think they are the map for, and we will use that within the reporting. So we will say, hey, this is missing one, but we have one and one only map that says they think it's their meter. So if you like, here is the map that, you know, best available data says is the right answer, and to try and obviously help to populate that. So, you know, we can't say absolutely definitively that's correct, but hopefully, you know, we can say, you know, it's likely to be correct. So, you know, you effectively trying to give you a bit of a fairly significant sort of leg up into to knowing what the correct value would be. And those new MTD items that I was talking about before, we only introduced them mid-sprint, and obviously, as I say, the program's been also pushing cleanse on the historic there. So I haven't seen as much progress on those as we would need to see. So I think they would carry over. So really, it's largely a carryover or a return for Energize No Meter with that one extra map ID item. And then there's really a question on CDSP. There is a significant level of differences. However, the CDSP reconciliation, you know, cut-off is April, so effectively the new annual process will be starting shortly, which means that the current data is, you know, a year out of date. So we recognise that, you know, perhaps we need to take a pause on that, work through that issue in terms of getting access to more frequent data, and then revisit that later. But interested to get views on that, and we're going to have a Slido vote on that in a second. And then the other thing we did also just want to raise is there are a slew of data cleanse reports that get produced. Many of those go back to the old data working group from faster switching. Many of those are focused around MTC reporting and related MPANs, which was a big focus for the programme. Clearly, MTC is going with MHHS. So what we just wanted to sort of work out is actually, are there any of the reports that like nobody's using anymore and they're not adding value, because, you know, let's stop producing them if that's the case, whilst it's, you know, basically an automated process to do it. So it's not, you know, massively time saving. It just means we're not punching reports out that people aren't using. It, you know, confuses. If you're new to it, it might be like, what do I do with all this? So, you know, let's kind of take some stuff out rather than just continually add, if that's the right answer. So I think we're going to go on to a Slido now where we put those 5 reports on a bit of a voting, and we'd like people to kind of rank them in terms of which of those you think is, you know, most to least important. And we've also got a free text question if you think there's something that we haven't thought of, which we may well not have done, and you know, another data issue that you're seeing that you think we should be focusing on for Sprint 4, we'd also be keen to hear about that. So I think the voting is open, as they say. You know, where do we need to be? Great, see if I can see things are coming through. Give people a couple of minutes just to rank those and see what the scores on the doors are. So I think we've got 11. Oh, I can see there's dots still, so 12. Okay, so interesting there. So Energize No Meter a clear winner, as it were, with new MTD. Okay. So interesting to see CDSP reconciliation exceptions sitting so high up, given the challenges with the age of the data. interesting to see. I'm just saying, is anybody? And nobody has captured. Although we've got other, but I think that's because we force you to put them in order. So you would have had to put other at the bottom if you didn't otherwise vote. But I don't think we've had any free text answers on the other, have we?
No, not so far. No free text answers.
Yeah. So nobody's sort of finding anything else. So can we just go back to the voting for a second? Sorry, the previous. Just to see the results. Sorry, thank you. So probably the key question for me, I would say, looking at that, is on CDSP. I'd be interested in any thoughts on whether we carry on. At the moment, we have no new data, so the only thing we could carry on with is the existing data. Bearing that in mind, and the refreshed reconciliation comes through in sort of July time, by the time it's gone through all the various processes. Bearing that in mind, and obviously recognizing that people see it as kind of like middle of the importance ranking, is there, whilst it's important, would there be a view that carrying on with the existing data is helpful, or is it becoming a point now where you're having to do so much work to kind of filter out the noise that, whilst obviously we'd love to improve that data, it's just not kind of fit for purpose as it stands? Any views on that?
I'd agree that it's not helpful to carry on with the data. Like you say, it's just so old. I think on the last Rec Issues group meeting, somebody had put that they felt that they were wasting quite a lot of time on that. So yeah, I think if we can get new data, then fair enough. But if it is existing, I agree, it needs to go further down the list.
I think the aspiration is long term. Yes, we get more current and more frequent views of that data, but obviously there's a bit of time to work that through, if you like.
Yeah, maybe we take it out of sprint 4 and pop it in a later sprint.
Thanks, Len. Any other views on that before we move on? I'm conscious I'm hitting up against the timelines now. Okay, well, that's been really helpful to get perspective on priorities. We'll feed that into our prioritization and finalization of the sprint, which we'll talk about next Friday at RIG. Yeah, next Friday at RIG. So those of you who are interested, I would encourage attendance there. And then I think we just had one final question, which was to that point around, are there any reports that people are sort of going, don't know why we're bothering that anymore, in terms of, nobody's looking at it, stop producing it. So I think we had a separate, poll. Was it the next one? Yes, that's the one. So if there are any reports, feel free to do it as like a grouping rather than like listing every individual, AR3, A3, B3C, etc. But if there are any reports that people feel, we just don't use this, there's no value in it, and we can strip it out, it just sort of simplifies guidance in the process a bit, perhaps.
Andrew, I can leave the poll open as we move on.
Yeah, let's do that.
I think
we're probably on or just fractionally over time, so Joe might have to speak slightly quicker. So if there are reports that you don't feel you need, if you just drop it in that poll, that'd be great. And yeah, thanks very much, Jenny. We'll obviously hoover up the results at the end. So that's it from me, everybody, on theft and data. So hopefully, given they were the two most important topics, that was useful use of everybody's time, and that was a helpful overview and run through. Thanks for your questions and interactions.
Thank you, Andrew. Just moving on. So if we go on to the next slide, we're just looking at the performance trends from our last quarter, from October to December last year. In December, we noted a 25% reduction in the number of instances where a party's risk driver is above the threshold set by PAB. This reduction was noted whilst the number of processes assessed remained approximately the same. In regard to the domestic switching performance, domestic switching volumes have remained in line with the previous quarter, which is a slight increase, which has been noted due to internal migration activity by some suppliers. And then for non-domestic, we have seen an increase in the volume of switching towards the end of September, more so to the beginning of October. But this is much more coincidental with the October contract renewal window, and then it's a return to the previous activity levels since then. And then if we move on to the next slide, we're just having a look at the brief summary of the current risk driver cases scoring above threshold. We can see a decrease of 35% for retail risk 8. This risk driver, we monitor outliers who are using the objection process more than other similar organisations. This behaviour may indicate a risk of negative consumer outcomes such as delayed or prevented switching, which can be due to suppliers potentially misusing the objection process. We've also seen a decrease of 43% for risk drivers 6 and 10. Parties finding themselves over threshold for this risk driver is due to submitting invalid requests to CSS or failing to maintain accurate registration data and delaying a customer switch, which consequently signifies failing to meet the fundamental market standards. For risk driver 5, we've seen an increase of 75% of cases above threshold. This means parties who are above the threshold have been found to have delays in their switch, meet and read dispute resolution processes. For this, it's important to note these processes ensure customers receive timely and accurate first and final bill, and where for parties fail to meet the expected standard for resolution, it can lead to a negative consumer outcome. I'd like to note this does not necessarily indicate that something is going wrong, as it looks at both the missing reads and the disputed reads, and reporting doesn't know what read is closing the dispute. So we're hoping to build on the reporting surrounding this and get some better clarity on the code in the future. And then lastly, we have seen a small decrease of 7% for risk driver 12 for erroneous switches. It's important to minimise the number of erroneous switches made, as these can prevent customers from registering with a supplier of choice, which can result in a negative outcome for them as well as the market participant, and increase consumers' disengagement with the switching arrangements. And then if we move over to the next slide, this will be focusing more on the next priorities for next quarter. So we've got 7 of the main priorities on this slide. I won't go into too much detail for the REC service deep dives, KPI reviews and accuracy of reporting, as Anton's already discussed this earlier in the webinar. But in regard to the performance assurance operating plan, this will run from the 1st of September to the 31st of August, and we'll be telling parties over the next quarter what will be important for them to know. Some things will include the annual report will follow over from the operating plan, so keep an eye out for this, as we would like to work together with REC parties to develop this. For the MEM performance reporting, we're developing an initiative to introduce MTD reconciliation for electricity and looking to enhance CDSP reconciliation for gas. This has been included in the data cleanse but has been limited in checking how parties have progressed. We're working to look at reports to compare and see if there are changes with the CDSP data. For the annual rating approach, it's been developed earlier mentioned in the webinar, and the annual report from PAB is expected in April 2025. So please do keep an eye out for this to be communicated from us to you. And then just moving on to the next slide. We've got a checklist here for parties. As we noted earlier in the year, we showed you a similar checklist, and everyone found it quite helpful to go over these. For submitting monthly data, it's important for suppliers, DNOs and service providers to do this on time, so there's no delay in our analysis of reports. These party roles should also be ensuring they are reviewing the performance dashboard every month. And then moving on, suppliers, MEMs, DNOs and GTs should make sure they are reviewing and actioning all quarterly PATs received from us. We've moved to quarterly PATs, so this allows you time to reflect and rectify within that quarter. And then I know I don't want to go through too much as it's all quite visual. I know everyone has the slides, but I'd also want to mention there's a webinar next week for RO155, which will be applicable to the non-domestic suppliers if you'd like to join to learn some more. But that's everything from me. If I want to hand over to Anton.
Yeah, well, we just wanted to think about a massively important part of our role as an assurance function, which is looking at how the services are performing. So if we flick on to the next, So we look at quite a range of different things, but the kind of the center, the core of it all are the performance levels that are set out in the service definitions. So we've seen improvements in the performance. We've got about a 2% uptick in metrics. Now that doesn't mean that this is not George Bush mission accomplished, is it? That's a 2% improvement. I think there's still more to be done, and there's improvement initiatives there that require some step changes. Our key activity has been trying to look at this either annually for the lower risk services or biannually for the higher risk services holistically to see what the trend is, to see if the PAB needs to intervene in any of those areas. When they do intervene, there have been performance assurance techniques. Often this is about understanding why first and making sure that the service providers are really focusing on that root cause, and that we don't want to be talking about the same issue again in 3 or 6 months' time. Based on feedback from suppliers predominantly, but parties in general, the PABs also received information on rec transformation. I think one of the things that I have seen in feedback time and time again is about there just being so much on. I guess that is a feature of the industry, given the kind of the need for transformation with net zero, but actually understanding how that's controlled and considered, and making sure that different impacts are assessed to make sure that what looks right for one project doesn't seem crazy to say a supplier or a different type of party who receives 10 requests all at once or 10 significant changes all at once is really important. One thing that happened last month was a deep dive into CSS performance. I kind of touched on that in the stuff further to the left. This looked at address management. It looked at information security and performance levels. I think information security is probably a different kettle of fish, but probably where we are on address and on performance levels are probably plateauing, and that the progress done so far, probably something needs to change in order to kind of make those step changes. I think in both of those areas there is a case for a need for improvement. Actually, this happened and was scheduled in advance of Ofgem kind of coming to a similar-ish position in relating to RECO and DCC working on a CSS improvement plan. We've made sure these things stick together, that they're aligned. I think it's really important that even though there are different teams across these different functions and parties working, if they have a shared goal, that we should kind of connect and integrate them as you would do in your business. And the final one, the KPI review, we want to make sure those KPIs are right for the people receiving the service. This is not about, I don't know, it says availability is supposed to be 99.9. Like, is that what's achieved? That's a different thing. That's the performance levels. The question is, and this is probably quite an easy question to answer, is availability important? And in that case, clearly it is. But in this area, we are looking for, what KPIs are working, what are measuring the right things, what are kind of redundant, and maybe just a bit of things that were in there with the best of intentions but aren't worth continuing, and what are omitted. Are there any areas of performance that need to be measured? Clearly, service providers are sensitive to make sure that that's done in the right way. The one that we're working with first is ERDS. So that's a service, I'm sure many of you know this, provided by the DNOs. So the DNOs are very keen that we do that in the right way, and we think about the right things, and that the results are things that are appropriately socialised. As we work through, we do have an approach that does involve us doing the first part of the work, but then consulting with the industry. I think that's quite key to make sure that any kind of final recommendations or decisions are kind of robustly evidenced, and that things that other organisations can see that suggest that maybe a new KPI or a change to a KPI might not be appropriate or fully considered. So that's that's an important one to consider. Our intent is to cover the key REC services over a few years to make sure that these KPIs are really hitting the spot. I think that's probably a great thing that we can do at this stage. If we move on, I wanted to talk about what we'd be covering at the next webinar. I think that's quite a good thing. So this is the plan that we shared with you in September with not much of a change. So when we shared this, I think it did ask for an energy theft and a data cleanse deep dive, which is why we've scheduled them now. We thought that was the most logical time. But you can see we're working through our plan and that we have done what we said we would. In June, we will be looking at what kind of priorities should we have for the next year. Actually, getting better connectivity with parties is fundamental to getting better kind of value out of this service. So I think some of that should be webinars, different people like connecting over different channels, but also we'll be looking, see if we can do that through PA check-ins or anything like that to make sure we understand what problems you're experiencing and what your priorities are so that we can make the best value out of the time and information that we have. The next one, I touched on it very briefly, didn't I? I think it was a quick run through, but a REC services deep dive. So those who've been here in the past might have seen that we've bought kind of graphs that say kind of what's the average level of service level performance versus like the top and bottom, and what's the trend, and what interventions have there been by the PAB to try to drive up performance, or perhaps areas where the service providers have had issues and been able to self-correct, because let's be honest, that is the key goal. So that's what we'll be covering in June. We'll always talk about what the forward plan is, because that seems like a really important thing for us to talk about. We'll always talk about like what have we learned that we should be sharing, and Jade did that earlier. And we will always be looking for your input, as we have done mostly through Slido today, to help us steer our work into the right area, and to help us kind of pick up things that might be risks that you can see that we haven't yet seen. So that's all I wanted to cover on that. So having shown you what we plan on doing, saying that we'll listen, are there things that are missing? As a free text thing, it normally takes a little bit longer for people to do this one, so I might just stay quiet for a second.
I think it's important to note as well, alongside that, there is a final call for a Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to type it into Slido now, and then we can cover those as well. Again, Anton, I can leave this slide open for a while, and then we can move on to if there are any final questions.
So feel free to ask us any questions you like. Those who know me, I'm more than happy for you to put your hand up, or like everybody wants to talk directly to us, do they? Or to put it in a kind of Q&A, a kind of little bubble on Slido. So feel free.
Or perhaps just because we do have a little bit of time now, you can raise your hand if you want to raise anything, and it's easier to express.
Hi, Chris.
Yeah, hi, Chris.
Hiya, how you doing?
Good.
Good. Just I don't know if it's an observation or whether the REC are working on anything, but on the CDSP gas reconciliation, I think the advice from the REC was to submit the ones we'd worked and cleared as exemptions in the first month, and then potentially that would be us sort of, if we'd completed all of them, that, you know, we'd sort of be done and dusted on the 3 that had the, you know, 3 mismatch criteria. But we then subsequently saw that when the new files were downloaded each month, you know, you have like a column on that file type to say it's been raised as an exemption. That wasn't filled with a Y for the ones we'd raised as exemptions in the following months.
Yeah.
So it was like, well, you know, for the case of our reporting, it then looks like we haven't cleared them. But I did check it out with an inquiry, and sort of the service desk came back and said, no, that's fine. They'll be accepted. But it just makes me sort of a little bit fearful that if we don't raise them as exemptions along with the other exemptions we raise monthly, that suddenly we're going to get to the end of the sprint and it's going to look like we're not where we actually are. Yeah.
So the exemptions for that report we did make. So you're right. The normal process of exemptions have to essentially be reclaimed every month. Because obviously that data wasn't moving, it didn't really feel like it made sense for you to have to keep reclaiming the same ones. So we did make them sticky. But it does sound like something has gone awry there, Chris. So sorry, would you, if you're okay to say it in a public forum, can you just tell me which organisation you're from, Chris?
Yeah, so we're Good Energy.
Good. Okay, cool. Limited. What I will do is I will ask one of the team just to have a look. It might be that there's been a problem with the file. Not sure. But let me get the team to find out, and then either we can come back and go, yeah, no, we've got what we need, it's all good, or sorry, excuse the pun. Or you know, there's there was a problem with the file, because I'm not sure. The service desk may have come back at first line and say yes, that's the right process, or it may have got across to the second line. So I kind of need to just dig into it a little bit. But thanks for raising. But to confirm, if you tell us about an exemption on the CDSP, you only need to tell us once, because the nature of the work is, telling us repeatedly you've done something once doesn't feel like anybody is spending good time on that.
Exactly. No, good stuff.
Thanks. Cool. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for flagging. We'll look into it, and I'll make sure somebody comes back and just confirms either way.
Thank you. And assuming there are no questions on Slido, I'll open the floor one last time for anybody to raise their hand if they have any questions. Great. Okay, well, thank you everybody for attending today's session. Just before you go, we do ask that you complete a small feedback form. It just lets us know what we're doing well and what we can improve. As always, your feedback is very valuable to us and helps us optimize this kind of event. So thank you everyone, and have a great rest of your day.